Hey everyone, this is Mike Foley, Staff Technical Marketing Architect in the vSphere Tech Marketing Group. And I am here to discuss getting started with vSphere with Tanzu from Shedquarters. And some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to be preparing your environment. This is a key portion of getting started with vSphere with Tanzu. If you think about it, you're actually building a cloud within your environment. We'll get into that more later. We're going to talk about some of the common gotchas around setting up an installation. The main focus is going to be on the vSphere with Tanzu Quick Start Guide. That's a guide that I wrote last year. Will get you up to speed with vSphere with Tanzu. This is a great guide for setting up a lab environment and kicking the tires and getting familiar with these new features. And we're also going to focus on the vSphere with Tanzu Quick Bites YouTube series that I did. This is a series of 3 to 5 minute YouTube videos that lead you through the Quick Start Guide. Now, rather than duplicate all of that effort here in this session, we'll talk about that. We'll show some examples of it, and then you can go off and go watch those at your leisure as you're stepping through the Quick Start Guide. And then finally, we're going to focus on where to go to get more information. There's lots of information out there, and we're going to show you some of the places that you can go grab that. So stick with us, and we're going to get started right now. Hi, everyone. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do, we're going to go into our search engine. We're going to search for vSphere with Tanzu Quick Start Guide. And what you'll see there, it is the first hit on Google. Additionally, you'll see other links to other bits like the vSphere with Tanzu Quick Bites video series. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So let's click on here, and this is where we're going to get started with our prerequisites. All of these are called out clearly in the Quick Start Guide and in the vSphere documentation. So if we scroll through, we'll see in the prerequisites that there is a need for 2 separate routable subnets when you are configuring vSphere with Tanzu. You also have to enable HA and a number of other bits and pieces. All of these are clearly called out in the guide and also in the videos. Let's look a little bit first at the overall architecture of it. What you'll see is that we have for the management network, either a vSphere standard switch or a vSphere distributed switch. That is going to host the management interface for vCenter, the ESX hosts, and the HA proxy VM. And then we have a vSphere distributed switch, which is used for the workload network port series of connections. And that is connected to the supervisor cluster nodes live on that network in addition to the management network. And it is also connected to HA proxy. So when a developer comes in and wants to run his kubectl command, also known as kubectl, he uses the virtual IP that's been given to him by you, the vSphere admin, and he connects to that. That routes through HA proxy to whichever one of his namespaces that he is allowed to access. The next big thing to take into consideration is the workload management network and carving that up. I'll be right back with more on that. So load balancer networking is probably the toughest thing that you have to do to configuration. And the video I have in the Quick Start series goes through that, but I'm going to give you a preview of what that's going to look like. So let's say we have a typical /24 network, and that is completely open. And we have to use a number of these IP addresses. So we have a IP address for the load balancer appliance. That would be the HA proxy appliance. .253 is being used for the gateway IP, so we can't use those for any of the workload management networking. So what we're going to do is we're going to use CIDR notation to block out a chunk of IP addresses. So using, in this example, 10.174.72.0/25 gives us the load balancer IP range. This is the range that the supervisor and guest cluster nodes on the workload network use. The next block we're going to reserve is the virtual IP range, and that's the range of IP addresses offered up by the load balancer that will route to a TKG cluster or application. So these are the external IP address ranges. So if I connect to 10.174.72.212, it will then map to one of the IPs in the /25 range that may be running a TKG cluster. So here is the carved up /24 that could be used as an example for carving up your networking. We have the load balancer IP range and the virtual IP range. So as I mentioned, on the vSphere homepage, there are a number of quick bite videos that lead through each of the steps in configuring your vSphere with Tanzu and HA proxy environment. And all of these are here within vSphere with Tanzu Quick Bites playlist. And the first one, configuring a vSphere cluster for vSphere with Tanzu, will go through all of those pieces around setting up the networking that I just showed you. The next thing to set up would be the vSphere with Tanzu storage policies and content library. Let's look at the guide and go down to that. So we'll zip down to the networking. The guide has a number of examples in the UI, but I also included a whole bunch of Power CLI examples. So if you're someone who wants to automate a lot of this, the examples are right there, and I do have example scripts up on the Tech Marketing GitHub page as well. That will configure all of the VDS switches and such. And then when you configure VCSA, you're going to create a cluster, enable vSphere HA and DRS, add your hosts, enable the appropriate traffic types, and configure your shared storage. If you are using vSAN, now is the time to create your vSAN data store, ensuring that you have vSAN traffic enabled. And again, I've added some Power CLI to configure virtual switches accordingly. The next big thing is storage policies. And storage policies are used in order to place the Kubernetes environment in the right places. And the UI for setting this all up is rather involved. I do have here in the storage policy Power CLI examples, very, very simple example to just zip right through and create all of the appropriate storage policies. Here you'll see the UI example, and you have to go through and create a category and tags and make sure you get all of those done appropriately. And I found that the PowerShell example was a lot easier. The content library. Now, the content library you'll see here is a subscribed content library. And we also have a video on setting that up as well. Now, what that does is the images that run a TKG cluster are Photon images that have been set up with all of the appropriate bits installed. They live out on a content library that's hosted online. What you're doing is you're setting up a content library to pull that content to a local content library, and that's a subscribed content library. And we set that up. I also provided some Power CLI to set that up as well. new content library, appropriate data store, so on and so forth. The next major step would be HA proxy installation. That is where setting that up and workload management later on can be where things get a little difficult. And that's why you really have to plan out your networking, as I showed earlier. Here's where you're going to be selecting all of your IP address ranges and so forth, as I showed you in that diagram. You want to write those down. Make sure you select them, write them down, because you are going to need them later. Within the vSphere with Tanzu Quick Bytes series, there's a whole section on load balancer network explained, and then HA proxy installation, and then workload management setup. It really makes it a lot easier when you can watch someone walk through all of those pieces. We just don't have that kind of time available to us here today within a 30-minute VMUG session. I wish we could do it in 30 minutes. Maybe we'll get there in the future. If we move on down, we deploy the HA proxy and go through all of those pieces. Make sure you download the latest version of HA proxy. As of this recording, it's 1.20, I believe. If you would prefer, I wrote a Power CLI example for the deployment of HA proxy, so that if you do make a mistake, you don't have to go back through the UI every time. You fix it in the script and just rerun the script and deploy a new HA proxy. It's very, very simple. You can download here from the aforementioned GitHub vSphere Tech Marketing GitHub page. All of the code that's in here is available there as well. So with that, instead of going through all of these UI examples, you just edit that and run it, and off you go. Enabling of workload management. So we've installed HA proxy. We've hit finish. All of the stuff is set. If you're going to use a self-signed cert, just leave that blank and let it go. It's all documented here. If you're not going to use a self-signed cert, then you're going to have to get it into the appropriate format to cut and paste into the UI for deployment, or into the script for deployment. Now we're going to get to workload management. As I mentioned, there is a whole video on vSphere with Tanzu workload management. The big thing here is that you're taking the information you use to deploy the HA proxy, and you're taking the information that you're using for your network layout that we went through earlier, and that's where we're pulling everything together and making sure we put things in the right places. This is, as we showed earlier, a simplified layout of what a kick the tires type of environment would be set for. Obviously, this would work in a production environment as well, but we're just talking about getting you introduced to vSphere with Tanzu. So we went through all of the workload management, networking, and so forth. There are a number of requirements. We mentioned the supervisor cluster. The supervisor cluster is a series of virtual machines that are running Kubernetes, that are the ones that are spinning up TKG clusters, or if you're using NSX, they're able to spin up vSphere pods. And as of 7.0 update 2A, you're able to spin up virtual machines using Kubernetes. Those VMs need 5 IP addresses, 3 for the VMs, 1 as a floater, and 1 as a fallback. You need 1 of these per ESX host, so you're going to need a minimum of 3 ESX hosts to get this up and running, 4 if you're using vSAN. VCSA is going to require an IP address, and the load balancer is going to require an IP address. All of these are on the management network. And as we showed earlier, the workload network also needs 3 IP addresses for the supervisor cluster and all of the other bits and pieces here. Here's where we're going to start entering in a bunch of information. This is probably the video you want to take the most care watching. is because one minor typo and you're going to have to redeploy workload management. And sometimes that can take a little while. If you're just trying this out, there is a free 60-day eval license built in, so you don't have to click on Add License. You're going to fill in all of your basic information, and you're going to go through the setup and configuration of workload management. And here's where you're going to be selecting your control plane size, the storage policies that we configured earlier, the HA proxy information, including the certificate that's used. So if you added a certificate or if you let it just self-sign a certificate, you have to retrieve that certificate. Funny enough, I wrote Power CLI code to go ahead and retrieve that certificate without having to log in. A lot of other folks say, well, SSH into HA proxy and go to this folder and grab the cert that way. Well, the cert is actually part of an advanced setting of guest info data plane API.ca cert. So grabbing that, re-encoding it from base 64 will give me the appropriate content that I need to just cut and paste into the UI or add to a script. Speaking of which, let me show a quick example of a script that I'm working on that uses the latest and greatest Power CLI. Hold on just a minute. So this is the script that I was mentioning about automating the setup of workload configuration, and I'll be pushing this out to the Tech Marketing GitHub page very shortly. And it's using the latest version of Power CLI and the new workload network management commandlets. So you'll see here I'm collecting information to log into VCSA, connecting to VCSA, setting up a bunch of variables, grabbing that certificate from HA proxy, and then I'm using the enable WM cluster commandlet and adding in all of the pieces, including storage policies, HA proxy information, management network starting address and address range size, and so forth, making that all very, very easy to configure without having to go through a lot of UI. And like I said, that will be available very shortly. You've gone through setting up workload management, followed the video on the quick bites, and gone through that with the vSphere with Tanzu Quick Start Guide. And, you know, one of the biggest, hardest parts are things like the IP address ranges and so forth. That can get a little confusing, but it is called out clearly within that video on setting up workload management. It will make it a lot easier for you. As we move forward through the guide, configuring the content library, adding that to workload management, we're now at the stage we've clicked finish and the deployment of the supervisor control plane VMs has started. You're going to see a number of errors and other things that happen during this deployment. That's okay. One of the biggest things that you will find in this whole process that if you don't configure it properly will come back to bite you is DNS. Because if you haven't configured DNS properly, none of this is going to work properly. You need DNS. It's 2021. You should be using DNS with reverse lookups. Make sure you have that all working, because if it isn't DNS, it's DNS. If you go to the cluster view within the vSphere client and go into tasks, you'll see all of the reconfiguring of virtual machines and deployment of virtual machines, and you will see some HTTP errors and so forth. Usually those are okay. After about 20 minutes or so on a non-nested environment, workload management should come up and namespaces should be available to you. So you should see all of the details. You'll notice that the supervisor control plane VM is managed using the vSphere ESX agent manager. Don't try to change it. Don't try to run scans on it. Don't try to remove devices or add devices to it. It's not designed for that. It's managed via the ESX agent manager. So now we're at this point where we can create a namespace. Now we're ready to create a namespace. Now, a namespace, if you want to think about a namespace from a VIE admin standpoint, it is like a resource pool on steroids. It is a resource pool, but also then grants you the ability to not only manage resources used by that pool, but also who has permissions to add VMs or containers or TKG clusters into that pool, who has the ability to just use the contents of the resource pool. I like to refer to it as a sandbox that you can give a developer, and they can do whatever they want within the sandbox, but they're not going to be interfering with the other kids in their sandboxes. That's how we're going to create the namespace, and you can call it whatever you want. You're going to select the network that we configured in workload management. Once your namespace has been created, now you can start doing things like choosing which storage policies are used by this namespace. So you might have a namespace that only uses flash storage, and you might have a namespace that only uses spinning disk storage. You can add your DevOps team's users and permissions. This is not giving them access to vCenter. This is only giving them access to run kubectl commands against the TKG clusters they deploy and against the supervisor cluster. They're very, very limited in what they can do. It sets the limits for the namespace and adds a content library to support the Kubernetes functions in that namespace. There is another Quick Bytes creating a namespace video. When your namespace is configured, you'll also have the ability to download the kubectl command binaries. You can modify permissions. So I can add user Mike, and I can give him the ability to edit in the namespace. That allows him to create or delete content that's running in the namespace. And when I say content, I mean VMs or TKG clusters. I select which storage policies apply. Those storage policies map directly to Kubernetes storage classes. Here's a use case example for the deployment of your first TKG cluster. We're going to use the kubectl command. You will then be logged in, and you will see what contexts you have to play around in. My colleague, Miles Gray, has written a fantastic getting started with TKG guide that literally picks up from where the quick start guide left off, using the same names and everything else that is used within the Quick Start Guide to then deploy TKG clusters. And that is on the vSphere TMM GitHub page. You could share that page with your developers. So what you have now is a working proof of concept. You could deploy this in production. Nothing in here says you can't. That's totally up to you. You may want to consider using things like NSX for better networking if you have that need. If you have a need to run vSphere pods, and I have a blog article on that, you will need NSX. If you just need to run TKG clusters, or your developers need to just run TKG clusters, then this is a great way to get started with vSphere with Tanzu. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Let me bring up the final list of all of the places you can go to get more content. I'll leave that up on the screen, and thanks. Take care, everyone.